The relay gave its first warning 16 seconds before it fell. Not a crack, not a groan, a pitch shift, the hum of the mounting changing by maybe a quarter tone, the kind of difference that registers in the back of the skull before the conscious mind catches up. 7 Fethali children were directly below it, their iridescent down catching the open deck's overhead lights in small, shifting colors. Their teachers stood 40 meters away, near the far observation panel. Nobody looked up. The wolf did. Civil logged the timestamp at 0.4 seconds. That was how long it took, from the first audible stress fracture in the relay housing to the moment the gray shape at the far end of the deck changed direction. 40 meters, 3 seconds. And then Sable was over them, body flat, head down, weight distributed across all 4 legs, and the ceiling came down on her shoulder instead of on the children underneath her. 31 species had a word for wolf. Not one of those words meant what Civil watched happen on the open deck that afternoon. Senior Warden Orath Pellan arrived 4 minutes later with a removal order already drafted in his primary manipulator. Civil could see the edge of the document from across the deck. He stopped walking when he reached the scene. His 4 eyes settled on different parts of it, each one independently. The children still pressed against the wolf's flank, the blood matting into gray fur. The small Fethali girl who had one fist gripped in Sable's coat and showed no interest in letting go. Pellan's front 2 limbs began their tap. 1, 2. He did not complete the third. He folded the paper. He put it somewhere Civil could not see. Civil stood at the monitor station and did not write anything for a long time. The part that changed everything, it wasn't the wolf. It was what happened 4 minutes after. Stay with me. 6 weeks earlier, the Velthari Cooperative Institute's Cycle 7 intake processed 1 human student. Civil opened the intake log at the beginning of that shift, as they had opened intake logs at the beginning of every shift for 11 years. The cursor sat in the field labeled Companion Animal Risk Classification. That field had a drop-down menu with 14 options. Civil had used most of them. They had never used the option at the very bottom, below everything else, which simply read, Earth, Predator Class. Someone had added it to the drop-down 3 years ago, when the Human Exchange Program was first approved by narrow vote. Nobody had filled it in before now. Civil filled it in. 3 intake technicians had already requested reassignment by the time the transport shuttle finished docking at Threshold Concourse. Civil noted this in the log under Processing Anomalies and did not editorialize. The Rithani institutional tradition held that a record uncontaminated by opinion was a record that could outlast the recorder. Civil believed this. Civil had believed this for 11 years and had never found a reason to question it until roughly that afternoon. But that came later. The shuttle doors opened, and Cale Wren stepped onto the concourse with a travel bag over one shoulder and a transport crate floating behind him on its platform. He was 19, by human reckoning, though the cooperative's intake form translated this to a developmental stage descriptor that Civil found imprecise. He was taller than most of the students gathered at the corridor windows to watch, with close-cut dark hair and the kind of stillness that can look like confidence or exhaustion depending on which way the light hits. He wore the standard gray exchange uniform. He had added nothing to it except a small patch on the left shoulder, a blue-green sphere with 1 moon. Before he stepped through the concourse gate, he stopped. He turned to the transport crate, leaned slightly, and said something to it. Not loudly. A murmur, 6 or 8 words maybe, directed at the ventilation slats near the top. Then he straightened, shifted the bag on his shoulder, and walked through the gate. Civil logged this as anomalous pre-entry vocalization, possible equipment check. The classification would take 2 full days to feel wrong. The crate contained a wolf. Her name was Sable. The intake scan had registered her at 34 kilograms, 81 centimeters at the shoulder, and a bite force classification that had caused the 3rd technician to request reassignment before the scan finished processing. The species entry read, Canis lupus, gray wolf, Earth origin. The behavioral assessment field, which Cale had filled out himself, contained the following. She prefers to be spoken to before entering new spaces. She watches glass. She is afraid of enclosed areas with no visible exit but will not show it unless you know what to look for. Civil read this 3 times. It was, as far as they could determine, the first behavioral assessment in cooperative intake history written in the 2nd person. The burrow, as students would come to call it, was the quarters assigned to Cale on the residential ring. A standard double room, single occupancy, with a sleeping area, a study alcove, and a narrow bathroom. The name came later, once the smell had established itself. Something warm and layered, earth and animal, and the faint oil tang of the leather lead that hung on the hook by the door. Students in the corridor nearby began slowing down as they passed without seeming to notice they were doing it. Civil documented this too, filed it under environmental acclimation patterns, and moved on. Warden Pellon reviewed the companion exemption file the afternoon of intake day. Civil was present in the administrative corridor, officially to deliver supplementary processing forms, and observed Pellon through the open door of his office. He sat behind his desk, the file spread across his primary and secondary manipulators, and his 4 eyes moved through the pages in the way they always did when he was building toward a decision, each one stopping on a different data point, reading the same document from 4 separate angles simultaneously. His front 2 limbs tapped against the desk edge. Once, twice, 3 times. In the corridor outside, 2 Vorency students who had been moving toward the refectory heard the 3 taps, looked at each other, and turned around. Civil filed the supplementary forms and left. The first formal restriction order arrived at Kale's quarters the following morning. Civil had a copy delivered to their own record-keeping station simultaneously, per procedure. The order required the companion animal to be kenneled during all class periods, all communal meal periods, and all shared space transit. In practice, this meant Sable would be confined for 18 of every 24 hours. The order cited Species Welfare Regulations 7.4 through 7.9, precedent from 2 prior companion animal disputes at other cooperative institutions, and a risk assessment that Pellon had commissioned, written, and approved himself. Kale read it at his desk. He set it down. He picked up the brush from his study alcove and went back to working through the fur at Sable's left shoulder, the same steady strokes before the order and after it. He did not send a formal objection. He did not request an appeal window. He filed the compliance acknowledgement within the hour. Pellon, Civil learned later, had expected the protest. The absence of it unsettled him in a way that 6 written objections would not have. What happened next was the lead. The training lead was braided leather, worn smooth in the grip section from years of handling, with a brass clip at one end and a ring at the other. The ring had a small dent in it, not from wear, but from a single specific incident that Kale explained to no one, which meant Civil had to note it without context as minor deformation to hardware, origin unclear. In private, in the burrow, the lead hung on the hook by the door and did not move. Sable moved freely through the space without it, and Kale made no effort to attach it. In the corridor, in shared spaces, in any room where other students or staff were present, the lead went on before the door opened. Civil watched this ritual from the first day. It took 3 days to understand it was a ritual. Kale would pause at the door, clip the lead to Sable's collar, and then they would both walk out. The clip took about 2 seconds. Students who passed that doorway often began to do so at the same time each morning, though Civil could not determine whether they were aware of it. The sound of the brass clip became, without announcement, a small daily event on the residential ring. Civil logged it as standardized compliance behavior, and privately found this characterization inadequate from the first moment they wrote it. The data on Earth animals at the Velthari Cooperative was not extensive, because there was no data on Earth animals at the Velthari Cooperative. In 22 years of operation, no animal originating from the planet designated Earth had ever been admitted past the quarantine threshold. Kale Wren had applied for a companion exemption 17 times beginning at age 16, across 4 separate application windows, and with escalating levels of supporting documentation that included behavioral assessments, training records, veterinary certifications, and a 9-page letter from the director of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Organization, where Sable had been treated after her rescue from illegal hunters. The intake board had eventually approved the exemption without comment during the 17th application cycle. A note in the processing file read, "Applicant persistence has exceeded administrative bandwidth. Approve and monitor." Civil found this note and read it twice, filed it, did not editorialize. On the 4th day, Pellon submitted a supplementary restriction. Sable's permitted exercise period on the open deck was reduced from 60 minutes to 45, pending a formal review of the companion exemption scope. Kale acknowledged the restriction within the hour, as before. He also submitted, quietly and without apparent urgency, a request to the intake board for clarification on which regulations govern the reduction, and asked that the specific precedent citations be included in the response. No response had arrived by the end of that week. Civil began following Kale's daily compliance route on day 5. This was, officially, within the scope of their monitoring duties. The Rithani institutional role of hall monitor required periodic verification of restriction adherence. Civil had discharge forms to fill. This was ordinary. What was not ordinary was that Civil found themselves at the open deck viewing panel at the same time each day, watching. Sable, during her permitted exercise hour, ran the length of the deck twice, and then stopped. She stopped at the viewing panel, the long stretch of reinforced transparency that looked out on open space, the slow drift of light from the nearest transit corridor and the dark beyond it. She stood there and watched. Her breath fogged the glass in slow intervals, each condensation patch forming and fading at the same rhythm. She was not pacing. She was not restless. She stood and looked at the dark the way certain species look at large bodies of water. Not afraid of it, not unaware of it, simply present with it. Civil stood at the monitoring station and wrote nothing for 11 minutes. On day 7, a young Fethali student named Orvine cut across Sable's path in a narrow service corridor. Orvine was small even for Fethali, her down still growing in at the edges, the iridescent blue-green not yet fully dense at the wingline. She was carrying a stack of study tablets and moving quickly, the way Fethali students often did when they thought no one was watching, and she came around the corridor junction at speed and stopped dead when she found a wolf standing 3 meters in front of her. The tablets hit the floor. Sable sat, not retreated, not tensed. She sat the way Civil had seen her sit when Kale gave no command at all, simply choosing stillness, her head lowered slightly. Her ears were back, not flat, somewhere in between, in a position that Civil's fauna reference files described as non-threatening orientation, but that looked to Civil like something closer to deliberate courtesy. Orvine did not move for 6 seconds. Civil at the monitoring station watched the feed and tracked the time, because tracking time was what a Rithani record keeper did when they did not know what else to do with their hands. 6 seconds. Then Orvine reached down, picked up the nearest tablet, and held it to her chest. Then she reached out her other hand, the 6-fingered one, the one still trembling slightly, toward the wolf's nose. Sable sniffed it, her tail moved once. Civil's temples went from their baseline pale blue to deep indigo in approximately 2 seconds. This was the fastest the color shift had ever occurred. Civil noted this in their private log and not in the official one, because the official log would show Civil had been standing at a monitoring station watching a feed that did not require real-time monitoring, for reasons that had nothing to do with compliance verification. The official log recorded the corridor encounter as uneventful passage, no incident. Civil did not tell Pelon. There was a noise complaint on day 9. 3 Vorency students in the residential ring had filed a formal report describing a low-frequency mechanical vocalization originating from room allocation 7 gamma, consistent with equipment malfunction, persisting intermittently between lights out and the first-hour mark. They had attached an audio recording. They had classified it under Station Safety Protocol 12, which required a formal response within 48 hours. Civil received the complaint at the beginning of the morning shift, processed the intake, and opened the attached audio file. Civil listened to it for 22 seconds. It was Sable dreaming. The sound was a soft, irregular vocalization, rising slightly, falling, pausing, rising again, the kind of sound produced by an animal moving through something in sleep, somewhere between a whine and a rumble, rhythmic in the way breathing is rhythmic when the body is not entirely still. It was not mechanical. It was not equipment. It was the sound of something very large and alive having a dream in a small room on a deep space station, and it had apparently been audible through the residential ring walls for 9 nights without anyone correctly identifying what it was. Civil sat with this information for 11 seconds before deciding how to classify it. Civil classified the dream sounds as biological vocalization, non-threatening origin, companion animal in sleep state, and filed the Vorency complaint as resolved. This was technically accurate. Civil understood that accuracy and completeness were not always the same thing, and had understood this for 11 years without it ever causing a problem. The understanding was simply a feature of the work, like knowing that a blank field in a record meant something different from a field that had been filled and cleared. One was absence. The other was removal. The distinction mattered to no one except the person who understood it, and usually that was enough. The hearing Pelon scheduled ran 40 minutes. Civil presented the incident log, the audio classification, and the compliance record to date: 0 deviations, 0 incidents, 0 unresolved complaints. Pelon's 4 eyes moved through the documentation at their separate angles. 2 Vorency students who had filed the original complaint sat in the observer section and clicked their exoskeletal joints at a frequency that, in Vorency social signaling, indicated sustained discomfort. Kale sat across the table from Pelon with his hands folded and said nothing, until Pelon asked him directly whether he believed the companion animal's nighttime vocalizations constituted a disruption to residential life. Kale said, "She was dreaming, I don't know what about." Pelon waited, in the manner of administrators who expect a longer answer and intend to make silence do the work of extracting it. Cale waited too, in the manner of someone who had given his full answer and saw no reason to add to it. After 14 seconds, Pelham closed the hearing and noted in the record that the matter would be monitored. Civil walked back to the monitoring station afterward and pulled up the cooperative's full historical fauna incident database. 22 years. 14 incidents involving registered companion animals. 2 involving animals that had shown aggression toward students. Both resolved with temporary removal and behavioral reassessment. Both animals returned to their owners within the same academic cycle. The field for Earth predator incidents was blank. Not cleared, not assessed and dismissed. Blank in the way a field is blank when the situation it was designed to capture has never occurred. Civil stared at that field for a while. In 11 years of record-keeping, a blank field had never required this much consideration. A blank field was simply a blank field. The absence of data was data. Everyone understood that. Civil was beginning to suspect that everyone was wrong about this. 3 days after the hearing, Civil observed something that did not appear in any official record. It was the end of the permitted exercise hour on the open deck. Sable had run her circuit, stood at the viewing panel, fogged the glass in her slow intervals, and then returned to Cale, who was sitting cross-legged on the deck floor near the far wall with his back against the paneling. He was not reading. He was not working. He was talking to her. Not the short functional words Civil had catalogued during transit and compliance checks, but something longer, quieter, with the rhythm of conversation rather than instruction. Sable lay with her head across his knee and her eyes half closed, and her tail moved slowly against the floor when certain words landed. Civil could not hear the content. The monitoring station was on the other side of the panel, and the deck's acoustic design was meant to contain sound toward the observation side. What Civil saw was a 19-year-old human from a planet at the outer edge of the cooperative's jurisdiction, sitting on the floor of a deep space station, talking to a wolf about something that apparently required 15 minutes and produced a response in the wolf's tail. Civil filed the session as companion interaction extended duration within permitted exercise window. This was accurate. It was also, Civil was beginning to understand, the kind of accuracy that missed the point entirely. A Leth containment suit passed Sable in the main corridor on day 14. The Leth were difficult to document at the best of times. They had no fixed physical form, presenting as organized vapor within their suits, and their collective mind structure meant that individual units experienced adjacent emotional states as shared sensation. The suit paused when it came alongside Sable. The vapor inside shifted, reorganizing itself in the way that indicated, in Leth social signaling, a sudden intake of new information. The suit's translation hardware, which produced output only when the collective agreed on a single word, processed for 4 seconds and then said, "Warm." Nothing else. The suit continued down the corridor. Sable watched it go, then looked up at Cale, who scratched behind her ear and kept walking. Civil wrote it down, filed it under interspecies contact events, unclassified. The Leth had a biochemical sensitivity to emotional states in adjacent life forms. They could detect stress markers, calm markers, the specific chemistry of fear and its absence. That the suit had stopped at all meant something had registered. That the single word it produced was warm, rather than any of the 17 Leth-registered threat classifications meant something else. Civil did not share this with Pelham either. On day 18, the proposal arrived. Civil received it as a standard administrative distribution, which meant it came to their station at the same time as every faculty record keeper on the ring. The subject line read, Companion Exemption Scope Review, Proposed Amendment to Human Exchange Program Guidelines, Cycle 7 Forward. The body of the proposal was 11 pages. Civil read all 11. Pelham was recommending the removal of the companion animal exemption from the Human Exchange Program, not for this cycle only, retroactively to intake and forward to all future cycles. The justification section cited species welfare, institutional liability, and the documented stress responses of precast students in shared spaces. It cited the Vorency noise complaint. It cited the 14-month-old maintenance flag on a relay mounting in the open deck, which had been deferred twice and was still pending inspection. Civil's temples went deep indigo and stayed there. This was no longer about Sable. Civil understood that with a clarity that felt different from the usual precision of administrative comprehension. If the proposal passed, no future human student would bring an animal companion through the cooperative's quarantine threshold. The door that had taken 17 applications and a 9-page letter to open would close, and the closing would be documented as policy, which meant it would be cited as precedent, which meant it would be effectively permanent. Kale had absorbed every restriction, every noise complaint, every cold corridor, every morning of clipping the lead before the door opened, so that when the next human arrived, the path would be shorter. The proposal would make that impossible. Civil filed the receipt confirmation and did not move for a while. The open deck free use period ran from the 14th hour to the 18th, 4 days a week, open to all students and supervised school visits. On the afternoon of day 21, a group of 7 Fethali Exchange children arrived for a supervised cultural tour, part of a program that brought students from affiliate institutions to observe the cooperative species integration model. Civil was at the monitoring station. The children were small, as Fethali children always were, barely knee-height, their down still the dense, soft growth of early development, their eyes taking up so much of their faces that expressions were mostly visible in the feathers rather than the features. They moved in a loose cluster, chattering at a frequency slightly above the human auditory range but well within Civil's, and one of them had brought a small collection of stones from her home world, which she was arranging in patterns on the deck floor near the base of the far observation panel. Their teachers stood at the opposite end of the deck, near the entry corridor, reviewing the afternoon schedule. Sable was in her exercise circuit. She was 40 meters from the children, moving at a steady pace along the outer wall, not leashed. The open deck was one of the 2 spaces where the restriction order permitted off-lead exercise. Civil tracked her on the monitor feed as a matter of course, as they tracked everything on the monitor feed as a matter of course. And Kale was visible at the eastern panel, standing with his forearms on the barrier railing, looking out at the dark beyond the transparency. The ceiling relay in grid sector 7 had been mounted 14 months ago. The maintenance flag had been filed 13 months and 16 days ago. It had been deferred at the 9-month mark due to a scheduling conflict with a structural inspection elsewhere on the ring, and deferred again at the 12-month mark for reasons that Civil did not have access to. The flag was still open. The relay was still running. The small Fethali girl who had been arranging stones looked up. Civil heard the sound at the same moment she did. A pitch shift in the relay's operational hum, a quarter-tone drop, the kind of change that precedes a mounting failure when the housing has been under load for 14 months without assessment. The girl looked up because the sound was different, and she was close enough to the floor that the vibration came through before the acoustics did. Civil opened the emergency alert interface. The mounting gave. What happened in the next 3 seconds was, afterward, a matter of official record. Civil had the monitor feed, the timestamp system, and a precision stylus that had been trained for 11 years to record events as they occurred without the contamination of interpretation. The timestamp showed 0.4 seconds between the first audible stress fracture in the relay housing and a change in the direction of the gray shape at the far end of the deck. 40 meters, the wolf covered it in just under 3 seconds. She did not herd the children. There was no time to herd them, and she did not try. She went flat over them, all 4 legs wide, head down, body distributed across the cluster, and the relay's housing edge caught her across the left shoulder with an impact that the structural survey would later record at 34 meters per second. She did not move. The children were underneath her, pressed against her flank, feathers flattening against the warmth of her. One of them had both hands in her fur. Another was making a sound that Civil's translation system registered as too high frequency to classify, which meant it was the Fethali distress call for very young children, the one below conscious production. Sable's head was down and her breathing was audible on the monitoring feed. Steady, deliberate, the slow rhythm she used at the viewing panel. Kale reached her in 11 seconds. He did not check the wound first. He placed himself between Sable and the rest of the deck, hands open at his sides, and said, "She's hurt and she's protecting them. Give her a moment." His voice was level, the same pace before the relay came down and after it, and Civil, who had been logging Kale Wren's vocal patterns for 21 days, understood something in that moment that had not been in any of the behavioral assessments or intake documentation. The calm was not a response to the crisis. The calm was what Kale Wren was. It had been there on the concourse when he stopped to speak to the crate. It had been there when he brushed Sable's coat after reading the restriction order. It had been there in the 45-second silence during Pelun's hearing, when 2 administrators had tried to use silence as a tool and found that Kale had more of it than either of them. Orveen's teacher had been running since the relay gave. She reached the cluster of children at the 30-second mark, knelt beside the wolf's shoulder, and began speaking to the children in the soft Fethali frequency that the translation system tagged as reassurance, adult to young. She did not try to pull the children away from Sable. She spoke to them where they were. Senior Warden Orath Pelun, arrived 4 minutes and 18 seconds after the relay fell. He had the removal order in his primary manipulator. Civil could see the document from the monitoring station, could see the way Pelon held it, angled slightly, the way he held documents he intended to present rather than simply carry. He walked toward the scene with the bearing of an administrator whose decision had already been made, and then he reached the edge of the scene and stopped. His 4 eyes moved to different points. The children still pressed against the wolf's flank, the small one still holding on, the blood matting into the gray fur at Sable's left shoulder. Orving's teacher, who had stopped speaking and was now simply present beside the wolf, her hand resting on the deck near Sable's front leg. Kale, standing with his hands open. And Sable herself, whose golden eyes tracked Pelon's arrival with the steady attention she gave to everything. Present, assessing, neither threatened nor threatening. Pelon's front 2 limbs began their tap. 1, 2. He did not complete the third. The removal order went into his secondary manipulator. Civil watched him do it. Neither Kale nor Orving's teacher saw it happen, because Kale was watching Sable and the teacher was watching the children. Pelon looked at the scene for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the corridor entry, and as he passed the Fethali teachers who had come running from the far end of the deck, he said, "The relay in grid sector 7 requires immediate replacement. File the maintenance completion report when it's done." He did not say anything else. Civil did not move for a long time after he left. The official incident report took 4 hours to write, which was 3 hours and 40 minutes longer than any incident report Civil had filed in 11 years of service. The facts were not difficult. The facts were the timestamp, the impact velocity, the position of each individual at each point in the sequence, the medical assessment of Sable's shoulder injury, the confirmation that all 7 children were unharmed. Civil wrote all of this in the standard format with the standard precision. The report contained no opinion. The private log, accessible only to Civil under a personal encryption code, contained 1 line. "I have been a record keeper for 11 years. I do not know how to file what I saw today under any category that existed before today." The companion demonstration assembly was held on the last afternoon of the academic month. The main auditorium had been configured for full capacity attendance. 512 seats arranged in the curved ascending rows that allowed sightlines for species of varying height, with the holographic relay panels positioned near the ceiling for close-up viewing of smaller companion animals. The stage was lit in the broad spectrum setting that worked across the most visual range profiles. Civil had the record keeper's station in the lower right section, adjacent to the official proceedings log. Every seat was filled. Civil noted this in the preliminary record, and then noted, in a second line that was unusual for preliminary records, that the capacity had been reached 40 minutes before the scheduled start time. The presentations ran in sequence. A Grethani student with a crystalline beetle that produced subsonic harmonics. A pair of Vorency who had, apparently without consulting each other, both brought the same species of domesticated arachnid from their home system, which caused a brief procedural discussion about presentation order. A Leth student whose containment suit expanded slightly and reorganized during the presentation, which the attending faculty noted in their own records as the first time a Leth had voluntarily altered its suit configuration in a public setting. Kale was scheduled last. Before he was announced, Civil stood. This was not standard. The record keeper's station was an observer position. Civil had occupied it through 14 previous assembly events and had not stood during any of them. Civil stood, crossed to the stage-adjacent podium reserved for official proceedings, and read from the incident report. All of it, the timestamp, the 0.4 seconds, the 40 meters, the impact velocity at 34 meters per second, the 4-minute hold, the confirmation that the wolf had not moved from her position over the children until Kale gave a release command, at which point she had moved to his side and permitted medical assessment of her shoulder. Civil read these facts in the dry, precise voice that 11 years of institutional record-keeping had made permanent, and the auditorium was completely quiet. Pelon was in the 3rd row. He did not tap his limbs. Civil returned to the record-keeper's station. Kale was announced. He walked onto the stage with Sable at his left side, and the wolf's healed shoulder caught the stage light as she moved, a small bare patch in the gray fur that would grow back by the following month. Backstage before the announcement, Kale had stopped at the entry threshold. He had reached down and clipped the lead to Sable's collar, the familiar 2-second ritual, the brass ring cool in his grip. He had held it for a moment. The dent under his thumb, the worn leather, the 7 years of handling that had made the grip section darker than the rest. Then he had unclipped it. He had folded the lead and put it in his jacket pocket and walked out with Sable beside him, free. He set the folded lead on the speaking podium when he reached it. Nobody told him to. Nobody asked him to stop. He spoke for 20 minutes. He did not argue. He did not defend. He told them about Sable at 8 weeks, malnourished, terrified of enclosed spaces, flinching from anything that moved too fast, and how the first thing she had learned to trust was a human voice saying her name before a door opened. He told them about the lead, how he had braided it himself from strips of leather bought at a market near the rehabilitation center, how the brass ring had gotten its dent in the 3rd year when Sable had seen a deer through a fence and pulled before he was ready, the only time she ever had. He told them that he clipped it in public not because she needed the restraint, but because other people needed to see that he took her seriously. He told them what 15,000 years actually meant. Not that humans had tamed predators, not that wolves had been reduced to something smaller than what they were. He said, they chose us. Generation after generation, against every instinct that said danger, against every evolutionary signal that said keep distance, they chose to stay. And we chose to let them. And what grew from that choosing was something neither species had a word for before it existed. She did not learn that this station was safe, he said near the end. She learned that safe was the wrong question. The auditorium was quiet, 512 individuals from 31 species, and the silence was the particular kind that happens when a room is holding something it hasn't yet decided how to carry. Then Orvine walked onto the stage. She was still small for her age, her down still growing in at the wingline. She crossed the stage without looking at the audience and sat beside Sable and put her head against the wolf's uninjured shoulder and closed her eyes. Sable turned her head and touched her nose briefly to the top of Orvine's head, then settled and closed her eyes too. 4 seconds of silence. Then the sound started, and it did not stop for a long time. Civil's stylus was motionless over the assembly response field. The standard taxonomy offered 15 options, ranging from positive reception, moderate, to exceptional engagement, unprecedented. Civil had filled this field at 14 previous assemblies. It had never required more than 2 seconds of consideration. Civil typed unprecedented, deleted it, typed it again, left it. Across the auditorium, Pellin rose from his seat. Civil watched him. He did not applaud, the Thuresi did not have a physical equivalent. But he stood, which was the Thuresi formal gesture of recognition for an event that had exceeded institutional expectation. He stood and he watched Orvine with her head against the wolf, and his secondary manipulator was empty. The folded removal order was gone. Civil did not know when he had disposed of it, or where, and the record would never show it had existed. Civil noted the absence, filed nothing. 3 months later, the elective course Cale taught, Cross-Species Trust, a practical history, became the first class in cooperative history to maintain a waitlist across 3 consecutive enrollment cycles. Civil processed the waitlist documentation. The list included 4 Thuresi students. It included, in the first cycle, a Leth collective unit, which presented logistical challenges that the registrar's office had never previously encountered and ultimately resolved by adding 3 additional floor seats to accommodate the suite's expansion capacity. Civil filed the accommodation request, noted it was the first of its kind, did not editorialize. On the morning the second cycle waitlist was confirmed, Civil walked to the open deck before the first shift began, when the space was still empty and the automatic lighting had not yet brightened to its daytime setting. The viewing panel stretched the length of the far wall, the dark beyond it punctuated by the slow transit corridor light at the edge of visible range. The training lead was still on the hook inside room 7 Gamma, where it had hung since Cale stopped carrying it. The leather worn smooth in the grip, the brass ring with its single dent. He had left it there when he moved to the larger quarters the faculty housing office had offered in the 3rd month. He had left it there deliberately, in the way that people leave certain objects in certain places when they want them to remain part of the record. Out on the open deck, the morning light cycle began its slow rise. The viewing panel filled gradually with a pale, even glow, the recycled air of the station settling around the early silence. There was no wolf standing at the glass this morning, no breath fogging the panel in slow intervals. Only the light coming up, and the dark beyond it, and the stillness of a space that had recently been changed by something that passed through it and left no mark except in the categories that no longer fit.